Having covered the basics of human culture, the way in which it's expressed through language and cognitive models, how it's codified through social structures of marriage and kinship and so forth, having done all of this in the first 12 lectures of the class, today we're going to turn to the political and economic organization of different societies around the world. So we're going to begin with an influential typology that divides societies up into bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. And then we're going to focus today primarily on band-level societies, and in particular one named the Dobi-Juwansi of southern Africa. So let's begin by looking at Elman Service's very influential 1962 book entitled Primitive Social Organization, An Evolutionary Perspective. And in this work, he proposes a scheme that divides all societies in the world into these four types: bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. Now, before I get into this, let me add a couple of caveats. First of all, this typology has been criticized for being ethnocentric. In some ways, it's just updating, critics would say, Lewis Henry Morgan's scheme of barbarians, savages, and civilization. And we as anthropologists spend a lot of our time breaking down typologies, showing the great diversity of different cultures in the world. Many would say that anthropology is a discipline of exceptions. We always say, yes, but among the people that I work with, yes, but among the Bororo, that's not the case. And so we're very skeptical toward typologies such as this. But nonetheless, they can be useful. And this typology, like all typologies, it's important to keep in mind, is one of ideal types. No one society perfectly fits into any of these categories. But nonetheless, it can be useful in categorizing different levels of social complexity and social organization. A lot of this boils down to size. In a country like the United States, with a population approaching 300 million, we need very formal legal and political and economic structures in order to function. But a nomadic society with a few hundred members doesn't need these same sorts of mechanisms. So we're going to talk about bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. But keep in mind that this is not an evolutionary typology. Bands are not inevitably moving toward becoming states. As Franz Boas taught us, every society has its own historical trajectory, and all bands or all tribes are not going to eventually become states. States have been the most successful form of political organization and the most expansive form of political organization in the world. But it's not the apex of an evolutionary scheme. Now, size is an important distinction in these categories. Bands are very small, generally between 25 and 50 individuals. Tribes are larger. They generally have hundreds of individuals. Chiefdoms, larger still, with thousands. And states, nation-states, millions, hundreds of millions of people. They also differ in terms of their economic relations. So band-level societies, generally their economies are based on hunting and gathering, and they're generally nomadic peoples. In tribal-level societies, we find hunting and gathering as well, but they combine this with gardening and with shifting agriculture. So they're a bit more sedentary as well. They might move around every few years, but they'll stay in one place for a few years at a time. With chiefdoms, we find intensive agriculture, and we need intensive agriculture. Chiefdoms need intensive agriculture to sustain the population densities that they have. And finally, in states, we find market economies, occupational specialization, market economies, and more impersonal relations, more impersonal economic relations. And finally, in terms of political leadership, they're distinguished from one another. In band-level societies, we find situational authority. A leader will emerge just in a particular context. On a hunting trip, for example, the best hunter will emerge as the leader of that hunting trip, but after the hunting trip, he'll meld back into society and not retain that position of power. In tribal-level societies, we find headmen, people who have a formal position of power that they will occupy. And yet, this is what we call in anthropology achieve status. They have to constantly gain the support of the people that they're leading, and they have to reify this constantly in order to keep their position of power as headmen. In chiefdoms, we have chiefs, as is obvious given the name, and chiefs are denoted by having ascribed authority. So we have achieved authority in tribes, and we have ascribed authority in chiefdoms. And ascribed authority is basically inherited authority. One gains one's political position based on one's lineage, one's position in society, and this is ascribed authority. And finally, in states, we have centralized authority, and states can be kingdoms, they can be democracies, they can be dictatorships. But one thing that's distinctive of all states is that they have a standing army or a police force to enforce the social order and the political order. Now, in anthropology, we tend to avoid these days terms like primitive. We even avoid tribal, except when we're using it in this very specific context of a tribe level of social organization. More often today, we talk about small-scale societies or large-scale societies or ethnic groups, and we'll return to ethnic groups in a later lecture. And it's important to note that today, all bands, all tribes, and all chiefdoms live in nation states. There is no independent band-level society in the world. They all live within modern nation states. So to talk about bands for a bit, today about 250,000 people, about 250,000 people, are primarily hunters and gatherers living in band-level societies. And this is out of a population of 6 billion in the world. So a very small percentage of the world's population are today band-level peoples. However, they've been the object of an immense amount of anthropological investigation. So why is this? Well, partly the idea is that for most of human history, we all lived in band-level societies. So if we go back and look, or if we go to band-level societies and look at their adaptations today, maybe it can tell us something about our own common heritage. Also, in band-level societies, we find a lot of the basic patterns of human behavior that we find in every society in the world. Men and women pair off, they raise children together, we have an institution that we could call marriage, they share food in the same way that societies around the world do. And finally, they're rapidly vanishing. And so there's a bit of salvage anthropology involved here. We need to go out and collect this data and save this information before it gets lost for all of humanity. Now, as I've said, hunters and gatherers live in bands of 25 to 50 people. They're all related to one another by kinship or marriage. The size of a band is limited by the carrying capacity of the environment in which they live. And most of the time, actually, bands stay below their carrying capacity. And they do this by employing a number of birth control methods, primarily a long postpartum sex taboo. It's taboo to have sex after a birth for a period of time, which may be 1 year or 2 years or even longer in some societies. In band-level societies, the division of labor is based almost primarily on sex. Women do certain work, men do other work, but there's no occupational specialization. There are no full-time political specialists, no full-time religious specialists. So today I would like to focus the lecture on a band-level society, the Dobiju Wansi. They live in the Kalahari, on the edges of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, across the border of Botswana and Namibia. And for band-level societies like the Dobi, these borders mean very little. So they'll cross over the border into Namibia and they'll cross back over into Botswana, and there are no fences, there are no border guards, there's no way to distinguish what is one side or the other. Now, there are only 50,000 Dobi people living in the world today. They're also known as Bushmen, the Kalahari Bushmen. They were formerly known as the Kung, but this is a label that they don't use themselves. They call themselves the Dobiju Wansi, and this means the real people. And interestingly enough, this is what lots of ethnic groups around the world call themselves. We're just people. We're the real people. We're the only people that we know. And the term Kung and the term Bushman was given to them by neighboring groups. Now, they speak a San language, and the San language is a click language, as you can tell from the name, the Dobiju Wansi. So they have a number of very particular click sounds. And these are very hard for English speakers to say. And you'll remember in one of the earlier lectures, we mentioned that phonetic maps get laid down very early in life. And so it's very difficult for English speakers to learn these dramatically different phonetic patterns. Now, the Dobi are one of the most studied people in the world. We have more anthropological research done on the Dobi than just about any other group. And this is primarily due to the efforts of a team of people led by Richard Lee and Irving DeVore, who started working with the Dobi in 1963 as part of the Harvard Kalahari Project. And they went on to publish a very important volume in 1968 called Man the Hunter, which correlated the behavior of groups like the Dobi